Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Andrew Tallents. I am the founder and managing partner of the Talents Partnership. We're proud again to be partnering with Dan Wells, the founder of Grow CEO and Grow CFO, in the presentation of this series of 14 webinars about self-coaching. The webinars will be taking place on a fortnightly basis until October, and I'll let you know about the next webinar at the end of today's session. This is the 7th in our webinar series, and today's topic is all about trust. Before we get into the content of the webinar today, let's just take a few moments to settle into our own space, remove the distractions, and open our minds to learning something new about ourselves. We have an hour together today. I'm going to share some content with you and get you to do some thinking about how building trust with key stakeholders could help you live your life differently. This will take around 35 minutes today, and then we'll have up to 25 minutes for any questions that come up for you. You don't need to write down what is on the slides today because we'll also post these online, but I do need you to have a pen and paper to hand as I'm going to ask you some thought-provoking questions as always. I won't be looking at the Q&A box today, so as we go through the webinar, if any questions come up for you, then please write them in the chat box and I will answer them after the presentation. Some of you may have technical problems during the webinar today. If this happens to you, then just please exit the webinar. You can rejoin and be able to take off from where we left off. I also know the Wi-Fi has been very slow, so please bear with me if we get any lag today. Don't worry, we're also recording today's session and posting it onto the Grow portals on LinkedIn and on my YouTube channel. So you can also review the webinar at your convenience at a later date. Over the coming weeks, we will continue to explore some different aspects of self-coaching. In previous webinars, we've explored the importance of self-leadership, the question, who am I? We've also explored the question, why am I here? We've talked about the concept of essentialism, the disciplined pursuit of less, and how we can build our resilience over time. Last time we talked about how building our emotional intelligence can help us become more successful over time. And if you didn't manage to see any of those webinars, you can watch them on my YouTube channel at any time. Just type in Andrew Tallents into YouTube and you'll be able to find the series. As always, I'm very fortunate to be able to coach ambitious leaders to help them fulfill their potential and be successful in life. And in our coaching sessions, we explore many of the issues on this slide to enable a leader to learn how to start self-coaching over time so that they can sustain their success in the long term. Let's explore briefly what self-coaching really is. According to the International Coach Federation, coaching is defined as a partnership with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. Although the concept of coaching stretches back to when Socrates was around, in modern times, coaching has played a critical role in sports such as tennis, cycling, and football. But it was Tim Gallwey and Sir John Whitmore who took the movement of coaching from the sporting arena into the business world in the early 1970s. Tim Gallwey, who was coaching tennis students at the time, began to notice what was going on in the mind of his students was actually hindering their learning. He started experimenting with ways of helping players learn by developing their own awareness of the way they moved around the court and the way they hit the ball, not by specific instruction. He gave it the term the inner game and published his initial findings in the inner game of tennis in 1974. Later that decade, Sir John Whitmore realized that these principles could also be applied to business. He continued his research and in 1992, he published the book Coaching for Performance. The principles of his book are still used extensively in businesses today. My day-to-day coaching style is based on Gallwey and Whitmore's approach, and it's focused on enabling the leader to become more self-aware of how they can become more effective in their personal life, current role, and career management. During my coaching sessions with my clients, we identify ways that the leader can take their learning into everyday situations. Specifically, they learn how to coach themselves in key moments in relation to decision making and relationship building. I am enabling the leader to self-coach so that over time, they don't need to spend as much time with me. We define self-coaching as the process of leading one's own personal development through self-leadership and the support of others to help maximize their personal and professional potential. Through self-coaching, once you as a leader have decided that you're going to lead yourself first, and you have worked out who you are and accepting of who you are, and you have worked out your true purpose in life and why you are here, and then you commit to an essentialist life, enabling you to really focus on those tasks and relationships that enable you to fulfill your purpose. You are then in a position to learn how to build your resilience over time. And as you do this, you can become more effective at managing your emotions, and you can choose to react in the most appropriate way as events happen around you. Once you've made progress in all of these areas, you are in a much better place to start to build trust with your key stakeholders because you trust yourself. Building trust is the focus of today's webinar. I tend to work with leaders at 3 different stages of their career. They are either newly appointed into an exciting leadership role, they are being successful in their current role and want to move up through the gears to achieve even more, or they are lost in their current role and can't work out why they are lost. In any of these stages, it is critical to focus on building trust with the key stakeholders who have the ability to influence your future success. However, in my experience, many leaders choose not to build trust with key stakeholders in their lives. They decide to wait for the stakeholder to build trust with them. Particularly difficult stakeholders who are enigmas and play their cards close to their chests seem impossible to build relationships with. It is easier to spend time elsewhere rather than investing in the key stakeholder relationships. When coaching leaders, I tend to find that the following issues get in the way of them building trust with their key stakeholders. Many leaders, including me in the past, have some form of attachment issue that stops them getting close to people. This can be due to a traumatic event that happened in their childhood, or more recently in an important relationship. Leaders find it difficult to rebuild trust with key stakeholders when they perceive they have been let down by others in the past. They wrongly believe that others will make the first move in building trust with them, but when it doesn't happen, they wonder why the relationship is not as strong as it should be. Many leaders have a lack of understanding about who their key stakeholders really are. They believe that they are in control of their own future and destiny, and they can determine how successful they will be without much support from anybody. The reality is that all leaders need key stakeholders to be supportive of them through thick and thin. And stakeholders can range from shareholders to customers and everything in between. There is even an argument to suggest that most of a leader's time should be spent building relationships with key stakeholders so that they can rely on their support when it is most needed. Many leaders still display heroic leadership tendencies and don't want to show their vulnerability by making the first move in building trust. Sometimes pride and misplaced expectations that others should build trust with them get in the way of strong relationships. The reality is we can't force people to trust us. We have to become trustworthy, and the only way we can do that is by taking action to build trust with others. The leader is often not held accountable by their boss or their board, so there is a tendency to try and hold themselves to account and take on the habits and schedules of predecessors and fit in around others without asking for help. And as a consequence of all the above, the leader often chooses to spend their time managing situations and people rather than leading from a position of high trust in their key stakeholder relationships and therefore needing to manage others less. Why do so many leaders struggle to build trust? Many leaders lack the self-awareness of how their lack of trustworthiness affects their decision-making and their impact on others' ability to make effective decisions. They can't determine the likely outcomes of decisions as they don't have an idea about the level of trust in their relationships. Many leaders suffer from imposter syndrome and have low levels of self-confidence in their ability to build trust with experienced and influential stakeholders. This leads to self-doubt and avoidance of building trust and others start to lose confidence in their leadership, taking on responsibility for their own actions, which can lead to silo mentality permeating within the organization. Many leaders are uncomfortable showing vulnerability as they believe this is a display of weakness. However, it has been proven now beyond doubt that being human and vulnerable is one of the key ways in which we build trust with others. We show we are human and that we need help, and others can relate to us because of that, and they want to help us. Trust builds in a relationship. Many leaders are poor at time management and feel as though they are being effective by spending all their time in meetings and getting through their to-do list. This leads to inconsistent decision-making on the run in between meetings and lack of availability for team members. They actively choose not to spend time in building trust with key stakeholders, as there's always something that needs to get done. In every coaching session I have, my clients always make assumptions about how key stakeholders feel about them. They don't have enough trust in their relationships to ask the key stakeholder directly how they feel about them, and know that the answer they receive is honest and delivered with the best intentions to support and build the relationship further. You can only get truly honest feedback from stakeholders when you trust each other. When a leader starts to build trust with their key stakeholders, it leads to higher performance over time. If trust exists in the relationships, then relying on others to deliver against their objectives becomes easier. And this leads to less time managing and more time setting direction and leading and removing obstacles. Being vulnerable demonstrates how others can support the leader. And if they can delegate effectively and trust in the relationship, then others develop more quickly and take on more responsibility and accountability in your relationships. Building psychological safety to encourage openness and creative tension within teams also leads to high levels of performance, as team members find it easier to hold each other to account. Liverpool FC are a great example of where Jurgen Klopp has created a trust-based culture where each team member is encouraged to speak out and is heard in relation to the overall team goals. This then enables the team to become more agile in difficult circumstances through knowing each other better and relying on each other when things get tough. Building trust enables a leader to hold themselves accountable more easily as well, as they are able to think clearly about how key stakeholders will react to the decisions and actions they take to deliver against their purpose and their long-term goals. They can do this effectively because they have built trust within their relationships and are trusted to do the right thing by the organization. I'm sure some of you are wondering about what evidence there is behind the importance of trust. What are the best ways to build trust, and how does it actually work in practice? To help answer these questions, we will focus on 5 areas. Firstly, we will explore Stephen Covey's ideas around the trust bank. We will talk about the in-depth global research that happens each year, where Richard Edelman produces a measure that measures the amount of trust we have in brands and institutions around the world. We will also explore Patrick Lencioni's ideas around the trust pyramid in relation to building trust within teams. We will look briefly at Google's in-depth exploration into the importance of trust in building effective high-performance teams. And finally, we will look at the more recent work of John Blakey and his research into the 9 habits of trust that we can all practice and improve each day in our lives. We've spoken about Stephen Covey's 7 habits of highly effective people before. In this book, Covey talks about trust being the glue of life. He describes the concept of the emotional trust bank. Let's use a simple example to bring his idea to life. In your relationship with a friend or a partner, there are times when you make trust deposits. You get home on time, you take the rubbish out each night, you remember anniversaries, birthdays, you keep your promises and go beyond your commitments out of love and gratitude. The trust balance in the trust bank looks pretty healthy, and your friend or partner will feel more inclined to support and trust you in times of need. However, at some point in our lives, a relationship becomes distracted. We become distracted by thoughts and events, and you start to become home a bit later than agreed, miss meal times, start to forget the jobs you agreed to do around the house, and now the trust balance is low. It's much harder to ask the other person to trust you when they need you. Although this is a simple concept, it really does help us to assess where our key relationships are right now. I would just like to take a moment now to think about a relationship you are worried about. Think about the last few weeks and months. In terms of your actions, where is your trust balance now? What can you do to top up the trust balance and improve the relationship? Take a moment to make a note of an action you can take after this webinar to improve your relationship by increasing the balance you have in the trust bank. When we do an exercise like this, it brings home the reality that the only person that can improve our relationships is us. We cannot control what the other person in the relationship does. We can only invest in the relationship by building trust credits in the trust bank over time. Over the last 20 years, Edelman, one of the world's largest communication firms, has produced a global research study called the Edelman Trust Barometer. Each year, the company surveys over 34,000 people in 28 countries and measures the public's trust in a variety of institutions and organizations. It is widely accepted as the definitive study into the trust we have in the organizations that serve the planet. During the last 2 decades, the research suggests that trust has been eroded to the extent that today we have more trust in NGOs and businesses than we do in government bodies and marketing agencies. This has profound implications in how governments can regain the trust of their populations over the next decade, and it will involve stronger collaboration between private and public sector organizations. For anyone wanting to build trust with key stakeholders, this study is a must-read. In 2002, Patrick Lencioni published his book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. The book centers around a business fable that highlights the 5 dysfunctions that stop teams becoming high-performing. He highlights the dysfunctions in a trust pyramid. His premise is that teams must work through from the base of the pyramid, up each layer, to the top of the pyramid. His argument is that you cannot proceed to the second level until there is complete trust in the team. Once trust exists, there can be open conflict between team members that can be focused on differences and how to work together to accommodate each other. Once conflict has been resolved properly, team members are more likely to have more understanding of each other, to be able to commit to each other towards the team goals. This in turn enables the team to create ways of holding each other accountable and will ultimately lead to better outcomes and business results. The key here is that conflict resolution has to take place when team members feel safe to challenge each other, and this can only happen when they trust each other enough to challenge bad ideas, poor behaviors in service of the team goals. If you've not read this book before, I encourage you to read it as soon as you can. It's an easy read and it can lead to team performance improvements in a short period of time. In 2012, Google embarked on a project that would fundamentally change the way they built their business going forward. They were curious to know what was behind high-performance teams. They studied 180 teams across Google's global organization over 2 years, looking for clues about why the most successful teams perform so well. The findings surprised them. What became apparent was that psychological safety, another word for trust, was the key ingredient to high-performing teams. It is worth reading the more detailed papers and research that support their findings. Just type in Project Aristotle into Google and it'll all be there. More recently, John Blakey, a former FTSE 100 divisional CEO, conducted in-depth research into what trust really is and how we can measure it. He often coached CEOs of organizations, and when he asked them the question, how important is trust to the success of your business, the CEO always responded that it was absolutely critical. When he asked them how they measured how much trust existed in the organization, the CEO would scratch their head and refer him to the employee engagement survey that had been conducted 12 months before. John was keen to research the subject further, and he published his findings in his book called The Trusted Executive in 2017. This is the first book I always recommend to my clients. In the book, John summarizes his research findings and presents his 9-habit model. John argues that if leaders develop and practice the 9 habits of trust, they will become more trustworthy over time. Some will come easier than others. As you can see from the diagram, John talks about 3 pillars of trust that are needed to become trustworthy over time: ability, integrity, and benevolence. He argues that the relationship between these 3 pillars are not linear, but they are interdependent. You need to be strong in all 3 areas to become trustworthy. We can all think of leaders who have ability and integrity, but are ruthless and don't succeed in the long term. Likewise, we all know leaders who are kind and honest, but don't have the required ability to lead an organization through tough times. John talks about the 9 habits that support the 3 pillars. If we develop and practice these key habits as leaders, we can build trust in our relationships. For the ability pillar, he talks about the habits of deliver, coach, and be consistent. Deliver, coach, and be consistent. Do what you say you are going to do. Coach others to be the best they can be, and be consistent in your communication and your behavior. These are all habits we can build as leaders and practice every day in our leadership roles. For the integrity pillar, John talks about the habits of be honest, be open, and be humble. This is where many of my clients really struggle. They need to learn to be vulnerable and authentic in their leadership style, and this is not always easy, particularly when the organizational culture discourages these habits. For the benevolence pillar, John talks about the habits of evangelize, be brave, be kind. Evangelize, be brave, be kind. Really powerful words. And again, these 3 habits can be tough to develop for leaders as they call for that courage, self-confidence, and trust in human nature. However, when practiced, they build trustworthiness in a very powerful way. All of these 9 habits are not easy to develop in today's work environments, but his research suggests that they are worth working towards. Have a think for a moment about the leader that you most admire and respect because of how you experienced them in life. How many of the 9 habits did they have? Just take a moment to think about that. How many of these 9 habits did that leader that you really respect and inspired you have? I tend to find when people do this exercise that most of the habits in there exist in great leaders that we've all worked for to varying degrees, but they've really worked hard on those without knowing they were working on them. The journey to building trust with key stakeholders is a long and challenging adventure. There will be times when you feel you are making breakthroughs and then the next day you are back to old habits. This is normal for all of us, and it takes time to develop our trustworthiness. So how do we put the learning from today into practice and build trust with key stakeholders over time? Think about the next couple of weeks in your life. Look for opportunities where you can create some thinking time. Think about your key stakeholder relationships. Think about the 9 habits. Which habit can you work on in the coming weeks? Make at least one commitment to an action that works the habit harder. Ask others to support you as you practice the habit. As we have some time today, I would like you to actually think about this now and think about it in the future, but let's take some time now. I'm going to ask you for 5 minutes or so to think of one key stakeholder relationship that needs to be strengthened at the moment, either in relation to your personal life or your work life. Just take a moment to think about that relationship. What are you worried about? Where do you really need to strengthen a relationship? And then think about the 9 habits and decide which one of the habits you need to develop that might improve your relationship with that key stakeholder. And once you've identified the habit, commit to only one action in the coming days and weeks that will enable you to practice that habit and try it out. For example, with a business partner of mine, I recognize I've been a bit tough on them recently because I felt they didn't deliver on a project we're working on together. Having looked at the 9 habits, I believe that I could be more kind to them at the moment. So I'm willing to practice this by offering some time next week to listen and try and understand what is going on for them in their world at the moment, to better understand why their performance level has been lower than I expected. So take a moment now, have a think about this. We'll have 5 minutes. I'll put the slide back up for the 9 habits. Have a think about the key stakeholder relationship. Have a think about where one needs to strengthen. Have a think about the 9 habits. Which habit can you practice, and what action are you willing to commit to? If you're watching this as a recording, then please press pause now and we'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, I hope many of you found that useful. And it's not that we expect everyone to have all of these 9 habits working in tandem at the same time. We know what our strengths are, what our natural habits are, but there are some that are worth working at where we feel they might improve the relationships that we have. So try and keep to those commitments that you've made in the next couple of weeks and just see how the trust might build. I have many examples to draw upon in terms of the this in practice. And the first case study that I'd like to talk about is about a newly appointed CEO of a transport business that I've worked with. She knew that she had to make sense of complex stakeholder relationships, both within and outside the board. The CEO initially expected the stakeholders to make the effort to build trust with her. They were busy people who had high expectations of her being the CEO. And she recognized that they did have other priorities. And she made the first move to build her trustworthiness. She spent time with each stakeholder to understand exactly what they expected of her. She was surprised actually that some stakeholders had lower expectations than she thought they had, whilst others had unrealistic expectations. But by improving her understanding and building trust over a 6-month period, the stakeholders became more engaged in her goals and supported her when she had to make some tough decisions. The second case study is about a newly promoted CFO of a complex technology business. Initially, they struggled to delegate as they didn't understand their team's strengths and weaknesses. He decided to show vulnerability around his own weaker areas and asked the team to create their own solutions that could support him in becoming a more effective leader. He worked hard on creating more time for key relationships, and over a 3-month period, he built trust across the team, and this led to commercial tension that helped each team member hold him to account more easily. As a consequence, he became more focused on his goals and his performance improved as a leader. So a quick summary of what we've covered in today's webinar. Trust is the glue of life. To build trust, we must become trustworthy. We cannot make others trust us. Using the Lencioni and Blakey models, we can build trust with others and within our teams. We can work on building new habits of trust every day, one step at a time. And we can ask for support and feedback in how we build trust with others and assess the strength of our relationships over time. As ever, to say thank you for attending the webinar, I'd like to make you all an offer today. If you would like to learn more about how to build trust, including some of the principles that we've talked about today with my support and challenge, then I'd be happy to offer you a complimentary 2-hour coaching session with me in the coming weeks. I have a limited number of sessions available from today, so if you are interested, then please contact me after the webinar and we can discuss next steps. Also, for those interested in John Blakey's work, I'm an associate of John's. He does a lot of great work with leaders and boards around understanding trust and building trust across the organization. So if you're interested in that, let me know and I can put you in touch with John directly. I know that some of you like to do some extra reading. So these three publications are certainly worth reading. The Speed of Trust by one of the Covey family. It's not by Stephen R. Covey, but one of his family, built on Stephen Covey's work. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which I mentioned to you earlier. They've now updated this post-COVID, which is a very interesting read to see again how the public's trust in our institutions has changed and what that means going forward for businesses that we're involved in. And finally, The Trusted Executive by John Blakey. This is the book that I always recommend first to my clients when I start working with them. It gives them a really good foundation to start being proactive about their relationships, which is usually what coaching is all about. So thanks for listening today. We're going to go into the Q&A. We took about 35 minutes, which is great. As I'm waiting for the questions to come into the chat room there, just wanted to make you aware of the next webinar. It is going to be building on today's learning and focuses on the importance of stakeholder relationships and how we manage them more effectively using trust, but other techniques. And that takes place at 11 a.m. on the 5th of August. I know many of you might be away then, so again, I'll be recording the webinar and putting it onto the YouTube channel, but I hope to see some of you there. So what we'll do is I'll open up the chat box and just see. What I'll do actually is just before we do that, go back, because I think some of the answers I'm going to give are going to build on this model. So let's just go to the chat. So we've got a few questions in, thank you. Hold on a second. So the first question is, how do you recommend coping with our feelings towards people who regularly tell you what you want to hear, but then their actions send a completely different message? Really good question and very common. So I think what's really important here is looking at this model in terms of the 9 habits. It comes back to this about being honest. So if you know that somebody is telling you what you want to hear, but then when they're not in front of you, their actions are different to that, then it depends the kind of relationship you have. If you're the leader, you can be honest and open about how you feel about that and how that it doesn't serve the team. If you are the person that's working for the leader and the leader is causing the problem, then again, this trust builds where you're honest with people and you display that vulnerability to say that you're not happy with it. And it's about being brave as well, which comes into the benevolence there, being brave to have that discussion. So whenever there's an inconsistency, if you can be honest, be open and be brave in terms of the way you approach that relationship, you're more likely to find the underlying reasons why they're being inconsistent with you in terms of their behavior. But again, you can look at each of these particular habits and apply them. I hope that answers that question. The next one is, what is the difference between being open and being honest? What if someone you believe has breached the trust? How many organizations have inner circles of trust? Really good questions. Let's take those one at a time. So what is the difference between being open and being honest? Well, if we take being open to begin with. So being open as a leader is about being vulnerable, telling somebody about how you feel, telling somebody what you expect of them, and telling someone as much as you can in terms of being transparent about what's going on in the relationship that you have. Being honest is almost a reactive way. When somebody deals with you and asks you for some feedback and asks you for something that's factual that you know about, rather than protecting the individual in terms of what you feel they should know, being honest in terms of your response around the feedback, rather than actually coating it with a sugar coating. Also being honest about the facts that you can give, again, builds trust because you're being then consistent, which is the habit we're talking about above. So there is a difference. Being honest and being open are different. In terms of the question about what if someone you believe has breached your trust, I think it's a really interesting one again. And all you can do if someone you think has breached your trust is obviously their trust bank credit has gone down with you. And it's about then the importance of that relationship. How important is it to you in your life? Is it a relationship that's key in terms of your success in life, both personal and professional? And is it worth investing in? And again, the only way you can invest in it is not by waiting for them to try and rebuild the trust with you, but for you to build the trust with them and understand why the breach has happened by taking one of these habits: being kind, being humble, be honest again about how you're feeling. Another question that's come in is, how many organizations have inner circles of trust? I would say most. I think this is one of the problems we have. There is an organization that will remain nameless that's operating in the sports industry. I know for a fact that even though it's a very big brand, that the inner circle of trust in that organization, which employs hundreds of employees, is 4 people. They are the only 4 people in the organization that really understand everything that's going on. And therefore, there's a lack of trust between that inner circle of those 4 individuals and everybody else. And therefore, you then get fear that comes into the organization, and also a lack of trust in the leadership. So yes, I do find that very common, and it's up to the leader to start broadening that circle out, to start being more trustworthy and more trusting of the employees in the organization. Thank you for that question. So the next question we have is, when direct reports make mistakes and they don't seem to be improving despite efforts made to help them, is it possible to still be vulnerable with them? Well, it's a really good question. And I think what we need to recognize here is about this being kind, being humble, and being consistent, and using the coaching habit in terms of those 3 elements. So if we really want to empathize with that person's situation, I think it's all about understanding that they're a human being and that we are too, and that we make mistakes. And sometimes the mistakes we make are not as big as some of the ones that our direct reports make in terms of the impact. So the answer to that question is, yes, it still is possible to be vulnerable in terms of displaying to them the recognition that you are human yourself and that you have made mistakes, and sharing and be open and honest about the mistakes that you've made, rather than hiding them and making it look as though you actually are more effective than they are. We all make mistakes. So I think the answer to the question, if somebody's still making the same mistakes, it comes back down to accountability and being honest and making sure that people deliver, but give them that chance and you showing that humbleness and that vulnerability to enable them to actually think that they can improve because they've seen you do that. So again, these are a lot of the questions that come up within our coaching sessions. And actually, in terms of most of the clients I have, trust is at the heart of most of their issues they come to me to deal with. So trusting themselves, but also trusting others and building trust in those key stakeholder relationships. I'll finish before any of the questions come in with one little anecdote. I was working with a divisional managing director a few months ago, and they were a divisional MD in a PLC. And we were talking about their future success and what would enable them to be successful. And what that divisional MD had forgotten about was how much influence the group CEO of the PLC had in terms of their future success. And they'd gone native and gone silo mentality and almost forgot about the importance of the group CEO. And they're quite a difficult character, and it's very easy to ignore it. And there was a light bulb moment with that divisional MD to actually understand if they were going to be successful in their business, they needed the support of the CEO at group level. And when I asked them the question about how much they really knew them, they didn't know them at all. They didn't understand them. They didn't know what made them tick. They didn't know what their expectations were. And ever since that light bulb moment, the divisional MD has sought to get closer to the group CEO, even though they're difficult to deal with, to really understand and build trust in terms of that relationship. As a consequence, he's now more in control and influencing his own future. So I think on that note, what I'll do is say thanks very much for your attendance today. The offer still stands around the free coaching session if that interests you. It's a great subject to talk around. And have a great rest of the summer. If you can make the webinar on the 5th of August, it'd be great to see you there. And if not, I'll see you on another webinar soon. Thanks so much for your time and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.